Hello and welcome to Varn Blog. And today I'm here with Andy of Antifada, co-hosting fame. Although we will be talking about a different project, The Spirit of May 28, and the incident that happened in my home state, in the Wilansi, our South River Forest, which is a wooded parkland area in southeast Atlanta, which I'm vaguely familiar with. I've actually been there because I grew up in Central Georgia. So, but in general, I think this is kind of an unfortunate way to kind of get a grip on what we're seeing now. With, I think what we both may consider an increase in the aggressiveness of the police state in times when a lot of people aren't paying as much attention. So, do you want to start with what the Spirit of May 28th is, or would you want to go directly into talking about the situation in Atlanta?
Hey, sorry, I'm hearing you double. I just gotta figure out why for a second.
No problem.
Just gotta vamp for a minute more.
So there we go. So for people who don't know, there was a shooting of a forest defender in Atlanta. I guess now a week ago.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, I think it was on Tuesday, maybe Wednesday. Yeah, there was a raid. They have these raids pretty frequently. There was a big one in December, but the cops were consistently raiding this like occupation of the forests. Sometimes going after the tree houses that's on the more of the Cop City side, and then sometimes going after this camp that's actually a public park. It's public for now, and but this was apparently a pretty big one, and they were really trying to get the tree houses out. They had gotten the tree houses out before, like I don't know, earlier this year, maybe in May, but people rebuilt it and actually rebuilt more tree houses. So I think this raid was specifically trying to get everyone out of those tree houses. And I do not know the details other than what I've seen people saying on social media. But at some point, about 12 of these, I think they were DeKalb police officers, if I'm not mistaken, opened fire. 12 of them opened fire on, by their account, it sounds like they were shooting into somebody's tents, and they murdered one of the forest defenders. Nicknamed Tortuguita.
Tortuguita. And they claim that he shot first, but we don't even have evidence that he had a gun, correct?
Well, they have a picture of a handgun that they claim matches the ballistics that hit the cop, and they claim they have paperwork that the gun was registered to them. So there is evidence, but these are all things that the police have been known to lie about and have the ability to fake with a drop gun and fake paperwork and all that stuff. They might not even have done the fake paperwork because the investigation is being handled by the people who killed them. So I'm not saying that for sure. I never met the person. I never met Tortuguita, unfortunately. I don't think anyone there would have done something like opening fire on cops. You know, that was not the vibe down there. So I don't believe the story. It's certainly possible. But it kind of, I don't know if we'll ever know for sure because these cops lie all the time. That's their MO. And if a cop was shot, maybe they shot themselves and are, and then they open fire and now they're trying to cover it up. They definitely seem worried about it, which they should be.
Well, the GBI at first said there was no body cam footage, and about a day ago, they said that there actually is body cam footage. So maybe there'll be some.
We'll find out or not.
not that the GBI's got a great stellar track record. For those who don't know, that's the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, and it kind of is what it sounds like it is. This has gotten international news, though. I mean, I think the first thing I read about it was in The Guardian, with the environmental activists saying that we've not had these kinds of killings before. And I'm still confused, because I'm like, okay, so you're claiming that a cop was shot, there's a gun, but the shooter was in a tent and it was a handgun?
That seems like what they're saying, yeah.
Yeah, that's real hard to believe. Like,
yeah, it's
so are they saying that he shot from within the tent?
They said they discovered them in the tent. So
they
I
had
don't know if
time
that
to
means
get back into the tent before counterfire, or like, I have no idea how that works.
right. The story doesn't really add up to me. It
doesn't seem to add up to much of anybody but the GBI. Like,
right. But yeah, also, people on the grounds, like, I haven't seen any firsthand accounts of it from like other forest defenders, but they say that they just heard like a ton of shots all at once, and then that was it. So if it was like they opened fire and then there was return fire, you would expect to hear like a few handgun shots and then the return fire. And it sounds like the defenders didn't hear that, which is kind of, if they're all like lying, that was kind of a specific sort of lie. But
yeah, it's something else. We know the track record of cops on this, and we know, I mean, I guess we should get, for people who have been following this or haven't read about it yet, we know, for example, that like part of the contention here is this is a public park that was granted by charter. The City Council of Atlanta voted to overrule that charter, even though they're not really supposed to build a GBI training facility, not a GBI, a SWAT training facility in the forest, developing the forest center. And the forest defenders have been protesting this now for 6 months, a year. That it's been
almost
while.
2 years.
Yeah, almost 2 years. So
yeah, and it's it's a little more complicated than that, but that was like a pretty good summary of it. There's also this Hollywood studio involved, which sounds like it's not actually going to be a Hollywood studio, but condos. And it's really, to use a term that a lot of people don't like, it's a very intersectional struggle, or at least the activists have done a good job of pointing out these intersecting struggles, because it's a question of the police, a massive training facility that will train police from all over the country. So there's a question of like policing and, the Black Lives Matter and the George Floyd uprising. There's a question of environmentalism, because this is the biggest forest in Atlanta. And the city had previously said that this forest is vital to the sustainability of Atlanta. And they were determined to turn into a public park, but then they sort of sold it and did a land swap. So this huge forest is going to go away. And I think Atlanta's explanation for that is they're going to like plant more trees somewhere else, some bullshit like that. There's a decolonization aspect, because it's Muskogee lands, and Muskogee people have done events and talks there and had meetings there. And they have said that the struggle is important to them. What else? I mean, it's just got everything, like racial justice. That's a Black neighborhood around it that will, these condos and businesses will help with gentrification of the area. So it's, I feel like it's in some ways, even though many people would say like, well, I don't live in Atlanta, what do I care about this? It really is a central struggle, or a good example of the kinds of struggles that are possible today in the US, while we're like maybe in between uprisings or major like political upsurges or something. And so that's why I think a lot of people have flocked there to defend the forest, and like Tortuguita apparently like moved there and has just been living there for months.
So the Defend the Atlanta Forest movement and the Stop Cop City thing definitely seems to be it's an interesting developmental plan for the city to invest heavily in police as a part of a gentrification program. That's actually a little new. And I am been kind of surprised. I only read one article, and it was in The Guardian, that talked about how bad the coverage has been for this in the area, because Atlanta is a journalistic market covered pretty much by the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and its owner is an investor in the police.
Exactly.
So.
But I've seen some clips of like local news, like televised news coverage, and it's all very positive. Maybe up until recently, I haven't seen anything this week, but prior it was like these activists are trying to save the trees because we need trees for the environment, and obviously it's a little bit more of a militant struggle than just that, but it's the coverage, even also on like a national level, has been pretty positive. But what concerns me though is, although I think it's something leftists, environmentalists, activists know about, I feel like it hasn't really struck an emotional chord the way like Standing Rock did. And I think that's what the activists on the ground were going for. I went down there for like this music festival. It was a great music festival. I just think they were expecting like thousands of people to come, and it was a lot smaller than that. So I'm glad that the word is getting out. Like Hassan Piker talked about it yesterday for 15 minutes, which is great, but there hasn't been a lot before that. And it's just, I try not to moralize that too much or be like, why don't you care? Because people have their reasons, but it was a little frustrating to hear a lot of like the avatar discourse between like indigenous solidarity, decolonized people, or like people who just think Avatar is cool and like it's sending a good message anyway. And it's like, why are you talking about this when like the thing that we're talking about, why isn't it happening, is happening? People are defending the earth and like developing new forms of like territorial struggle as depicted in the movie, but it's just not on the radar of a lot of leftists.
And if it turns out that the handgun is made up, which it'd be hard for us to know, but if it's, for example, we see that this is planted evidence or a concocted thing after the fact, I think also we need to be honest about the fact that while we have heard about these kinds of things in Latin America in particular all the time, in fact, I remember just going through the number of American activists who got their asses shot in Oaxaca and Chiapas doing similar things. This would be a first for the United States, like a just out and out killing of an environmental activist. If again, and I'm having to put all this legal caveats, the evidence is false, which it seems like, reading about this is interesting because I actually can't find a lot of articles that are supportive of the police action. It's not getting reported about much, but in so much that it is getting reported about, like, no one seems to buy the official story. So it's interesting in that regard, but because it is kind of, okay, so you're saying this guy who doesn't have a criminal history shot a cop from within a tent, or had enough time to get back in a tent and be how many times was he shot? Do we know?
No, but I read that like 12 guns were firing.
Right.
So probably a lot.
So shot multiple times. It does seem to have been a cop shot. That seems to be real. What I've read in The Guardian is that some of the defenders who talk think that it's actually an accident of the cop shooting, that one of the cops misfired and hit another cop.
Right.
But again, we don't know, and I'm going to caveat all that with there is an off chance what the cop said is true, but it would highly surprise me.
Like in the past, when these stories have come out before the videos, and then the videos come out, a lot of times the cops are lying, and a lot of times they aren't. But it doesn't really matter to me. I mean, I guess it matters in terms of, I am curious what happened, but I have no doubt that I want that forest to stay there. I think it's no matter what they're going to build there, especially these heinous things, but no matter what they're going to build, we need to protect the trees. That's like not the most Marxist thing to say, but I think everybody feels this sense of doom that, with everything changing environmentally, like climate change, like there's one sense of this, it's like this runaway train, we're past a tipping point, we can't stop it. On the other sense, like if we do want to continue living some kind of life in cities, there needs to be trees. And I guess like there's one future where we're going to have to change a lot of the way we live, but we can still live in like New York or Atlanta. And there's another future where these places just become uninhabitable. And it seems like Atlanta's making a choice. I like that, because I think the political class can't help but do what the police want and what Capitol wants. Like, Atlanta's a Democrat-run city. And I think that people want to make another choice. And even though a lot of the Atlanta forest defenders like come off as anarchists or crust punks or whatever, the people who want to defend that forest are, I think, representative of the general idea that we don't need to cut more trees to build more bullshit. The question is, how do we actually fight and do something about it? And, Atlanta shows one option that seems a lot better than the other options of talking about, like, what's wrong with the left that we can't get it together to organize or whatever. Like, you can have this conversation all you want, but, like, at some point people actually have to fight, and we have to figure out what'll make people fight.
A lot of what I study is the structural reasons why people don't do what they're what we believe they should do, or what the indications are that they would do. And I know you and I have had actually some disagreements, because I have been more of a damper on when people will actually choose to engage in radical struggle that's direct action related. And I think we need to like look at, for example, how many of these people, like how many forest offenders are getting hit with federal terrorism charges over this? It's at least 9, I think. There's a lot. So
11.
So one of the things we see with this police state issue is that, and I've noticed it in general, and I don't want to come down on, I don't want to pull the obvious thing where everyone's like, well, we have to go after these right-wing terrorists, because I've just seen a net increase of people being booked on terrorism charges. And historically speaking, it's environmental activists who get hit with it, actually, kind of the most, like even more, like people, and I think it's because they're frankly easier targets. Like, they're usually not armed. They do property destruction, and you can usually hit them on trumped up terrorism charges off of Patriot Act statutes pretty easy, without a lot of public backlash. So it's, it is what it is. One of the things that I've been pointing out is that a lot of these occupation tactics do involve direct confrontations with the cops. And I think this is, part of your Spirit of May project. It seems interesting, and by interesting, I mean cynically predictable, when Democratic Party adjacent media will sound sympathetic to such events. Like, so we think about the Freud protest and its recuperation, which was, well, protests, riots, revolts, insurrections, and I actually think we have to call them all that because it's different in different areas. But the way it's covered, I'd like to talk about how it's usually covered, where these things happen in the South and the industrial Midwest, and then like by the end of it, all the media is just looking at fucking Portland and Seattle, which does a specific thing. It moves the valence of who's being covered to like mostly white, mostly perceived as upper middle class, although that's not usually true, crust punks, whatever. And when you actually look at what usually happens on the ground when these things start and are maintained in the beginning, none of that's true. It's like it's a broad coalition of all kinds of peoples, usually from outsider classes and identity categories and demographics in areas that are either industrially bereft, or in the case like this, being imposed upon by urban development that you know, as a gentrification scheme, honestly, I don't even quite know what the city wants to do. Like this, I get the Hollywood studio project. That part of that is where
So
it
when I
going.
when I talked about the gentrification thing before, I think there was a lot more to it than this, but I think the Hollywood studio project is actually a ruse to build more condos. And that's not anything that's confirmed. It's just a lot of people who are familiar with the person who's planning to build these studios and like what he has actually done in the past and his relationship with the studios or whatever. It sounds like the studios is like a nice promise because it sounds like jobs and business and celebrities walking around in Atlanta or something, but really a lot of people think it's just going to be another housing development. But you're what you're talking about before is really interesting because you start talking about like what makes people want to fight, and then you start talking about the way the Patriot Act was used against environmental activists, and I just like that's I think the question that we should be talking about is like what makes some things pop off, like Standing Rock, for instance, the George Floyd uprising, but not this, or not like other killings that have videos that are just as bad. Like the conventional wisdom I think is that people see that these things don't work. Even though Standing Rock looked like it got a big win and then it didn't, and Black Lives Matter and the George Floyd uprising seem to have some like temporary success, but then there's all this recuperation. Do people not continue that fight like on the 1 year anniversary or something because they're afraid of repression, because they feel like what they've seen is that there's a total limit to what they can do and rioting actually doesn't change anything? Or did they just get their anger out and now they're over it and now they want to go to brunch again? So that's a lot of what gets talked about in the spirit of May 28th. Like two of the things that two of the articles we want to talk about today were about Akron, which is another case of like a young Black person being killed, Jayland Walker, and like a night of tension but no real riots. And then there was another article about I think it was Lexington, where when the cops who murdered Breonna Taylor got off, or mostly got off, there was like a mass mobilization that looked like it could turn into a riot, but there wasn't really much of it. And the article says like, well, a lot of the people who turned out to this riot or not riot work in logistics. Like there's these major logistics hubs in Lexington. Like, why wasn't there any thought of just having their protests there and shutting those down and occupying those, or or something, why is there never any discussion of things from the streets moving into workplaces, even when a lot of the people who are in the streets work at those places? And like, these are the questions we try to ask. We're not purely just saying like, isn't it awesome that people fought cops and burnt down a precinct? We're saying, why did they do it, and why didn't anything happen afterwards? Or are we still waiting for the next shoe to drop?
So, Andy, you're having some audio issues, so
Oh,
you
no.
might have to like log out and log back in. But I'm going to talk about some of that while you do that. So I'll recap when you come back. So one thing that I think we have to deal with is that there is a weird and perverse relationship between liberal media and direct action, in that direct action, when it's behind a hashtag movement, are all right. Let's try now.
How's that sound?
Much better.
Okay. Was there anything that I got cut out from when I talked before? I could maybe say again?
The last like 5 minutes was actually really, really crackly. I could understand you, but
well, to summarize what I was trying to say is that the Spirit of May 28th project may at first just look like this fan club for rioting, but a lot of the articles are like very critical of the way the riots have been perceived, but also like why the riots themselves didn't go farther. So an example of that is like, why wasn't there any connection between production, especially in Lexington, where there's all these logistics hubs that people who work there actually go out to the streets. And so one of the articles is about Akron. And so maybe we could talk a little bit about how we approached that article, which was not, I think like the classic anarchist move is just to say like, oh, the peace police came and shut everything down. Or like the people are too controlled by liberal mindset and they don't know that it's okay to fight or something like that.
yeah.
But the Akron article is more playing with the idea that like maybe people don't want to fight, and actually maybe they're right. Like, because it's not like as long as the proletariat isn't in open revolt, they're just stupid and brainwashed. But maybe there's a good reason not to try to do the George Floyd uprising every couple months.
Well, yeah. I mean, I actually think I spent a lot of time in that article because it was very useful. I was actually, when I was reading the Spirit of May 28th, I was like, okay, my first question is always, how is this not Ultracom? Now, for those of you who don't remember, Ultracom was a thing where it was basically a riot celebration communism that was that had a journal about, I guess now a decade ago.
I think they still publish actually every now and again.
It's
cool. Their stuff about physical culture is great.
And Ultracom had some interesting points, actually some of them about like logistics, when showing points where that I thought were kind of telling and telling in a way that's good. But I have, I think maybe this is a philosophical disagreement between you and I. I'm not sure. I remember reading, I believe, Joshua Clover's Riot, Strike, Riot, and going, and I just, the end of the book, I was just, I actually should probably find my copy that I had. I was reading it in Egypt and going like, okay, what do you do when the police quit caring about optics and start mowing you down, which I've seen happen in real life. And then what do you do when you realize that your mutual aid and stuff is running low? Because that's part of what sustained May 28. I mean, one of the reasons why we were able to keep it up is there was all this mutual aid and stuff kind of floating around early COVID. It was utilized to maintain a lot of that, and it went very well.
I heard it was it's kind of the other way around, that a lot of the mutual aid started on May 28th from the stuff that was looted.
I've heard both. So one of the
Okay.
things that I've heard is that the looting became a form of mutual aid uh in the like Twin Cities area, but in other areas where it supported, mutual aid networks were already existing pre-COVID. um One of the things, though, I think is interesting about that, I was going to ask you about this, is that a lot of the activism and stuff that was inspired by that, that was not in areas like Portland and Seattle, they ran into longer term problems, like the ability to keep there's a whole lot of, for example, during the riots, there were a whole lot of places that were basically more or less de facto captured and turned into like homeless shelters, and they started having issues being able to keep those up.
Hmm.
um
Yeah, New York too.
yeah.
There's the city hall occupation that I mean, I think it was a big success, but at a certain point, it just shifted like day by day into a homeless camp, and for whatever reason, activists just couldn't um, deal with that shift and abandon it, and then the homeless people got kicked out a few weeks after they abandoned it.
Yeah, well, I mean, I saw this in 2019 before May 28th. I've like seen these like anarchist and liberal activists work with homeless people. They do an encampment. They had one here in 2019 in front of the mayor's office. They hang out for a while. The activists do usually a brave, peace circle stunt, get beat up by the cops and arrested. And then the homeless people get kind of swooped up and things afterwards. When that doesn't happen in the case, and it didn't happen in a lot of the cases in the Floyd protest, actually, it seems like there's a lot of burnout, and there's a lot of the reality that like a lot of the issues that homeless people have, which I think are that the right capitalizes on and blames on the victims, but they are real. Um, are people who don't have mental health resources and have been allowed for this to go, completely unchecked in the streets for a long time because they don't have a lot of community. Community centers for homeless people have been broken up. One of the things that's been real that people have not really noticed that I've seen here in the West is there's actually been a decline in homeless shelters and like homeless centers, even makeshift ones. So like homeless people are not gathering together in groups. They are largely fragmented and alienated. You encounter
Hmm.
tons of them, but uh but you don't encounter them together. And even like, for example, something is seemingly anodyne as a church shelter for the homeless. My partner and I work with one out of a Methodist church. We have to use sanctuary laws so the cops don't come in and break that up. Like, because they really don't want um like any systemic relief for the homelessness problem here. They want to complain about it. They want to
Right.
like activate communities with it, but anybody who comes outside of the cops who tries to fix it is going to get hostility from the police.
Well, I mean, it's. I'm not sure how we totally got here, but I think it's actually a very relevant question about this surge in homelessness and its visibility, which is because to us, like, it's very obvious why this is happening. Is that rent goes up,
Mm-hmm.
and then there's other, economic problems in the lives of people who are on the lower rungs of the working class or falling out of the working class into poverty. And obviously, when you're in those situations, you've got all sorts of problems, and they just get worse and worse the harder your life gets. If you're no longer living in your house, living in your car, no longer living in a car, but finding like somewhere warm and sleep at night, and you're getting swept up by cops all the time. Your life just gets, no matter where you started. Maybe you started as an addict and with mental problems or something. Maybe you didn't. everything is going to get worse for you, and everything is going to get worse for more and more people as the middle class disappears in this country, as there's less and less real employment, and as rents and cost of living go up. And so when we see homeless people, we all know what that is. It's this process that's squeezing everyone. And some people deal with that anxiety as if to say, this is really sad, but I don't want to see it. And some people say, this is really sad, and I'm going to make some sandwiches for them. But no one thinks that there's a real solution. And the state obviously doesn't think there's a real solution. The best one they can come up with is figure out how to slowly build camps and prisons for them. And that's the direction that's headed. It's like technically illegal from the Supreme Court cases, but they're working on it. And so what I'm trying to say though is that, like, even though the activist response can be like, it seems, it's had limited success, and it seems kind of like a, I don't know, like you call it like a peace circle, and it's like there's stunts and stuff like that. I think that is very good, even if they are just like deluded, naive middle class activists, to go and work with homeless people and see what their lives are like, see what their communities are like. And also, it's a huge thing what some of these activists are doing in places like Minneapolis and the Bay Area and Los Angeles and elsewhere to defend these homeless camps, because those people are going to live much better. Although those places can be like very difficult, especially for activists to deal with, all of those people are going to do much better if they live together and collaborate in some way and have each other to support each other in some way. I'm not saying it's like a, utopian, but it's definitely better than living alone, like you were talking about. Like that isolation is a killer.
Yeah, and it seems clear to me right now that that isolation stuff is winning. Now it doesn't have to, but I do want to talk a little bit about the dynamic of young, usually fairly well educated, usually from pretty stable class backgrounds, activists who go into these areas. Because what I think you're right, they do need to see this. I actually also think one of the things that we should be thinking about in a positive sense is emphasizing and working with areas in which the slightly more stable ends of the working class, but who are not quote privileged, unquote, like the activist I'm talking about, to have more positive contact with these people. Because what I have noted, and I'm not the only person who's noted it, it's been noted in like sociological circles, a lot of these areas you have people coming outside to help people, and they probably do need help, and they definitely need help, who have from a like calculus of loss, don't have as much at stake as the people they are helping. Now, for the people in the lower ends of the working class, it is one rent check away from a lot of them being in the same position. And so there, interestingly enough, tends to be actually more hostility towards the homeless from those sectors than you see from people who are a little further away.
Because it's scary.
It's terrifying, right?
It's because you're not too, like you said, you're one paycheck away from that, and it's not there's other reasons. There's like legitimate reasons that people wish there weren't homeless people on their block. It's not all hatred and fear, but a huge part of, I think, why there needs to be, why the homeless problem can be solved through just making nicer shelters, and like, there's like a lot of ways the state can solve this problem for, I don't think, actually that much money. I think we saw that during the pandemic, right? When they started just like renting out hotels for people to stay in. But a major reason why it has to continue to some extent is to make people afraid, is to have that example that there's no bottom to your life in this. You can go all the way. That's why I like this scene in Mulholland Drive. You ever seen that movie?
Mm-hmm.
Where like the two people are in the diner, and the guy's like, I had this horrible dream. I saw this thing outside, and there's a jump. They like go out and go back to the behind the dumpster outside the diner, and there's a jump scare where you see like a homeless person who's covered in dirt. And I love that because like the jump scare for David Lynch in that scene is the thing that if you live in LA you see every day, which is a human being covered in like filth. And like there's just this horror in your life every single day, and the horror is coming for you if you do not hustle, if you do not rise and grind.
Yeah, I think that is. I mean, so a question that I have, I guess, is something that I would put into like the spirit of May. One of the things that you see in these big mass actions where they really take off, like they did in the Floyd, is that the distinction between activist, working class, neighborhood people, even some of the petty bourgeoisie who are somewhat sympathetic to the plight of their community. Not that I have a whole lot of love of the petty bourgeoisie, but we did see some of them be supportive. In that moment, like we saw in May of 28, those class divisions break down in like a productive way, right? People are put in contact with people. One of the things I think we have to deal with a lot of these activists, and I say this as one of them, so like people know, like I do a lot of this homeless work. My partner does a lot more than even I do. But is that there are needs here, and I think people, it's good for them to see it, but a lot of times they see it, they do it till they can not do it anymore, just like a lot of people who do care work, and then the whole organization that they're working with burns out, right? Mm-hmm. Particularly in months and months after one of these big events like the Floyd uprising, which is why like self-organization is an interesting question, and why we should ask why it doesn't emerge as much. And like I absolutely can't predict like when these things are going to stick and when they don't. Your article about Akron and Lexington really got me thinking about that, because I was like, okay, in the aught teens, we had like 5 of these pop off, explicitly BLM. Some of them were white cops. Some of them weren't white cops. Some of them were recuperated, such as Floyd. Some of them weren't, but there were big pop-offs, right? But how many of those events were there? Well, there were 5 of like I can think of 5 just in the local area in Salt Lake, mm-hmm. where we've seen people get shot unarmed by cops, and the cops claim they were armed, and then later on it comes out with body cam footage or whatever that they weren't. And and there's memorials to those people all over the city, but we didn't pop off like and I can't predict all the time except regionally, because I can tell you like these things tend to start in places that are highly hit, like these mid-sized post-industrial cities that have been kind of left behind, not kind of, have been left behind by development since the 1980s. That's where a lot of this stuff pops off, or when you see areas impose on that. So one of the things you talk about South Atlanta, and for those you don't know, South Atlanta is a kind of interesting area, because North and South in Atlanta is it is racially and economically gentrified pretty, and like actually kind of extreme, like particularly once you get out of up and out of the Atlanta city limits and out into like Marietta in those areas, and then up north in the places like Cumming, you have all this kind of like upper middle class wealth. It's becoming more democratic, even in the in the party sense. Lots of young oven professionals, but you go down in the South, and that's where, I mean, South Atlanta is like strategically been kind of left behind, and they would love to, I mean, even parts of the black bourgeoisie would love to turn that area into a development zone and push those people further out into places like Mount Zion and other suburbs into the city, which of course makes things, that push out makes things even worse for people who are precarious, because what happens as soon as you get out of the Atlanta area is you stop having public transit that's worth a shit. I mean, that's a big problem in Georgia. You stop having as reliable infrastructure. You have a lot of suburban infrastructure that hasn't really been maintained. The school systems are, I mean, we're talking about like that's the area where like the only public schools I know of to ever have been de-accredited exist. And so taking away that developmental land and gentrifying that, right? One, it's going to really economically damage the people of the area. And I know that it's kind of a catch-22 down there, because it also seems like if you don't gentrify it, then they let it rot. That's definitely true in my hometown in Macon. So like, but the other thing is like, there's a lot of Piedmont and low mount and like low foothill, like rainforesty stuff down there. And there's a lot of unique wildlife that has been developed away, particularly actually in the aughts. They were just cutting that stuff down, stripping it out for to build investment homes in the suburbs, partly to facilitate right flight and partly to facilitate just subprime marketization. And so a lot of that area was already destroyed. And that reserve is kind of been saved from that. It's clear that the whole current investment scheme into land, and for people who don't study economics, when things go, when the market looks like it's taking a downturn and credit gets expensive, if you have liquidity, people are going to tell you to buy real property. And so turning that stuff into, even if it was investment condos, like not even for people to really live in, would make a lot of sense, particularly in an area where like, oh, well, you can have this investment condo, you can live there to do this, movie thing. That's the kind of thing that we see in London, for example. London is full of that. But I want people to look at what it's also done to London. Like, it accelerates a lot of these impoverizational factors. So not only are you losing all those natural resources, you're actually making everybody poorer for, some backdoor investment properties. It's a very worrying situation. And on top of that, I think, tying it directly into a facility that exists to further militarize Southern police is worrying, right? But when you compare that to, say, Akron, I do sort of think like, well, what's the strategy you could use in Atlanta to shut that down? Like, where's the vital, thing you can hit at? And the occupation of the forest is, I think, important because it slows down development, but it isn't a logistic loggerhead. Like, it's not going to stop. It's not going to stop anything but the immediate developers. So there's not a lot of leverage there, right? So one thing you have to think about, like, is like, where would you want to support at? What kind of supports would you want to do? And I think, unfortunately, there's kind of this tension between formal organization that might actually think logistically, but has no incentive whatsoever to get involved like this. We can think about how the DSA approached May 2020. They were drug into it, right? And very late. But some of those people do have the logistic skills, right? They're using them for weird ways, I think, and we see where that's going.
The DSA is involved in Atlanta. They've been a part of the Defend the Forest Coalition. I'm not sure how well that's gone. I don't know the details of that, but I'll give them credit there for sure.
How much community is involved? Like, I'm no longer in Georgia, so I can't speak to community involvement there. I know that there might be a lot of positive community sentiment. I don't think anybody really wants to see that area developed who's not a developer.
Yeah, I doubt that. I mean, there's definitely a lot of people who live around there who don't like that there's this conflict in their backyard. And one kind of unfortunate thing about it is that the police have a firing range in part of the forest. So there's people always hear gunshots, and people are afraid that like maybe the gunshots are from the forest, and that also allows police to, whenever there's an action there, they like find a shell casing. They say a shell casing was found after this incident, implying that the protesters opened fire. But I think in general, there's a lot of community support, but it's it hasn't reached to the point where like the city is gonna there's like mass protests all over the city. The city's gonna get shut down. It's still localized to the forest itself, and I think it seems like the Defend the Forest people are doing everything they can to generalize it around the city and around the country. I just think the same reason why we haven't seen much since 2020 is that I think by and large workers, the kind of people who are can come out and fight in the past, they don't think it's possible right now, or they don't think coming out right now will produce any good results. And just when they do get together and they fight, there's a collective wisdom. I think that there can sometimes be a collective wisdom to not fighting too. And so I think even though the Defending the Forest is super popular, for whatever reason, it's just not mobilizing masses of people, and that's what you always need to succeed in wherever your project is, whether it's mutual aid, whether it's supporting homeless people, whether it's fighting the police. You need to connect with people in a way that's going to have them come out. And so it's that sort of alchemy that led to 2020, which is like the biggest uprising in my lifetime, probably much longer. That's what we're curious about. Obviously, the pandemic was a part of it. So there was a lot of things going on at once. Like I've even heard one theory that people just instinctively wanted to get out of quarantine in like a violent way for the purpose of going back to a consumerist existence. That's one sort of cynical theory. But there's an element to it because everybody protested for a week, and then, we protested for a week and we're not sick, so it seems like it's probably okay to go back to the restaurants that are now coincidentally opening. I think there's a lot of different forces that drive people to do what they want to do besides just justice or the environment or the earth or something. But despite that, I think that we're not, any indication that collective action is still possible, like in 2020, shows that we aren't totally isolated, that we aren't totally unable to figure out that our interests are in collective liberation and life together. And those flare-ups show that there's still that dream that people are willing to fight for, and I have no doubt that it's going to rise again. It's just impossible to know when. And why?
Yeah, I think you and I are about the same age, and I feel like I've lived through 5 cycles of this, and in some ways they get larger every time. there is a great big anomaly in the middle, and that anomaly is 9/11 pretty much stopped everything for 7 years. I mean, I was actually looking at it, and like labor action stops, rioting stops, protest actions stop for a little while, then become super big, but they don't seem to have any effect. And I would be interested, and I don't have a theory as to why this is, but in trying to figure out like whatever metabolic-ish rift, because there are clear patterns, but predicting, like I said, predicting what's going to cause something to pop off, what's going to start a pattern, seems to be very hard to do. One of the interesting things that I see looking at the long-term data is actually recessions are weirdly not good times for this. I mean, I guess it makes some sense. Like if you think about it, if the job market's super competitive and people are really worried about that, they're going to be more risk averse in general.
Yeah.
But
when I started working when I was 20, like around, even before the recession, like 2006, 2007, I would hear people say all the time, we're just lucky to have a job. I don't think people still say that now, but that's the kind of mindset that gets people to be more compliant in general.
Yeah, I think that's a huge thing to deal with, and I think we have to in some way figure out how to ride those waves. Like we got, like what we do at different times does kind of have to adjust to that. But like I found your Akron article, and I'm gonna read your thesis is on the party of Floyd as sort of a way to begin, and then it's close to your conclusion there. One, the party of Floyd is made up of all those who participated in the 2020 uprisings. It's not a formal designation, but a broad ecology of people who took part in the revolt. This historical party is composed of many different factions of proto-revolutionary movement in the United States. The remnants of the party of Floyd still exist, but it's confused, isolated, and fragile. The party is confused because the experience of 2020 remains a potent memory, and yet this memory is uncertain of itself, uncertain of whether it took the right course of action. The party is isolated because the proletariat is not coming out to fight in the same way anymore. Finally, the party remains fragile, struggling to hang on as a form because it is unable or unwilling to cohere into an organization. And the party of George Floyd will enter the next round of struggle with this reality of confusion, isolation, and fragility. It is obviously one of the worst positions to be in, but that is our reality. None of the fundamental problems unleashed by the 2007-2008 crisis have been resolved. In fact, most of them have gotten worse because there's no longer China that eat up a lot of the slack. The fundamental task remains to cohere the most advanced elements with new elements in the next uprising. And I've been talking to people, and even like mainstream economists right now do not feel good about the immediate future. I was looking at an index of like how many economists are predicting a recession in the next year and a half. And they're literally, I can't find a time in the last 30 years where you have more people predicting a recession. Now, maybe I'm worried that they're wrong, because in 2007, 2006, 2005, like those of us who were predicting a recession, and I was one of them, but I had no real platform, were basically laughed out of the room until Lehman Brothers collapsed. But I think it's interesting now because I think we are seeing that. I think there's a whole lot of I think the structural problems are clear to everyone. And I think we're also really seeing the environmental degradation problem. And you're right. Like if we lose all those green spaces around cities like Atlanta, in 20 years, Atlanta will be a hellscape. In 50 years, Atlanta is not inhabitable. Like it's just, actually, even thinking about it now, Atlanta has a massive water problem. For those of you who don't know, Atlanta's like water infrastructure was all built in like the fucking 20s for a population that was way smaller. And if you get rid of those greenlands around that area, even for development, you're going to increase water spill off. So there's going to be less water retained in the area, and they have to depend more and more on things like Lake Lanier. Georgia has been in drought, like I think like 3/4 of the last 20 years. But it's a drought that's been caused not so much by there have been huge weather pattern changes, but that's not even the primary cause. It's they don't have the water infrastructure. They need more rain than they have historically gotten, and they're getting less than they have historically gotten. So that's a major problem. And clearing out trees like that is going to mean that the evaporation and evaporation spill off is going to get worse in the city. This is happening everywhere. Like in Salt Lake, we're predicting maybe in 5 years that we're going to have an arsenic death cloud. Because the Salt Lake doesn't exist anymore. Like every time even in the 4.5 years I've lived here, every time I go out there, the shoreline is further and further back. So once that shoreline is gone, there's all these heavy metal deposits at the bottom of the Salt Lake that will be released into the atmosphere, and people are going to have to leave. So all these cities are like New Orleans. I don't know how New Orleans is going to exist in 10 years. I mean, I think like that close. And by the way, all these cities are in Democratic strongholds. This is not a problem of immediate political management. Yes, every state I mentioned is a red state, but those cities are not red cities. So
politicians don't have any real plans. When you see capital coming up with plans, like I wish I could reference it off the top of my head, but like in Miami, developments now are increasingly with the idea that Miami is going to be like Venice, like it's going to be flooded, and so new buildings have to account for the chance that the city will still exist after increasing, which is becomes submerged. Another example is Cop City. You have a city realizing, wow, Atlanta might really fall apart in the next few years. We're gonna have to make the police make sure the police are ready to put down the next uprising. We're gonna have to make sure that they're trained on a larger scale. And probably the best way to do that is to build like a whole big city for them to train. Like I think that is in a way their response to climate change. And like no matter if people behind that project believe any of the predictions you're talking about, or whether we believe in the predictions. I have to refresh.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I want to summarize what Andy said while he's refreshing, because there's some kind of weird buildup. Apparently, cops don't like us talking about this. I don't know. Let's try one more way.
How's that sounding?
You're perfect. I don't know what's happening over time. There's this weird buffering feedback loop building. But
just to summarize what I was saying is like whether like the ruling class believes these predictions of doom, recession, whatever, or whether we believe it, I think we all like kind of feel it in our bones. Like I think it's just so impossible to convincingly be an optimist for the like saying like the way things are existing now can continue existing for even the next 30 years. That everybody is starting to mentally adjust to everything all their stability falling apart. And we can't really plan for it, but I think the way people are acting and thinking is adjusting to that. And obviously the state adjusts to it by becoming a police state or whatever. But I think the proletariat is going to adjust to it in ways that we don't really understand yet, but we have to just kind of like watch. And these sorts of activism, like, going to the forest, going to Standing Rock, doing mutual aid, supporting Black struggle after police killings, is a way for us to sort of see what the proletariat is doing when they struggle. And of course, that's not the only way they struggle. They struggle every day on the job, in their buildings, and their families, or whatever. But I think what the left is doing right is going to these things and seeing what they are, and hopefully drawing good conclusions from them.
So I'm going to agree with you there. One of the things I can tell you, for all the criticism I have about a lot of this activist work, the way it goes, I only can make them because I've gone out there and helped them, or uh, provided logistics for them. So, for example, during the Freud uprising, I was in my home, but I was actually monitoring police stations and telling people where to move, like so
I
they
don't know
didn't
if
get
it's,
arrested.
is it
Like
just me? But it sounds like you're saying the Freud uprising every time. Are you
the
saying the Freud up
Floyd, yeah. I have a
in the
speech
chat?
impediment.
Ask people in the chat. Are you hearing Freud or am I just stoned?
I have a speech impediment when L's become R's becomes W's. So you
Oh,
probably are
is
hearing
that what
both.
it is?
Yeah.
Well, I've heard you talk for hours. I've never noticed it, so I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. So this in the Floyd uprisings, what we saw like was people actually getting out and getting involved and getting pulled into the heat of the moment. And then here, I mean, in SLC, it was not nearly as radical, although someone did flip and burn a police car. That doesn't happen much in Mormon land. So, just saying. But what we did have immediately was first a celebration of the situation, and then like local community leadership turned on each other like immediately here. And there was like competing NGOs formed and that sort of thing. Um, I think as critical as I am of that, I think that's still important to watch and know. All right, it's still important to see that we can all shit on that for happening, but if we want to prevent that kind of stuff from happening in the future, we do actually have to have seen it and witnessed it and thought about how it developed and happened. And part of that's active and by participation. Like I remember one of the biggest fights I had with Douglas Lane is when he was like, "Well, I don't need to get in, I don't need to listen to activists." And I literally said, like, "Look, you don't have to respect activists. I don't always respect activists. I get it. But you're in Portland. Get out your fucking chair and at least go out and watch. like, like you need to know what is going down. And you need to be able to speak to that beyond just the theoretical concern. You need to know what the logistics problems are. You need to know, like, how much fucking Narcan you need, how much water you need, what kind of, uh, uh, how do you stop a wound? Like,
Or I mean, just knowing the facts of who's fighting. Like,
yeah,
if it was incredible to see the online discourse about during the uprising, because people were saying like this is all white anarchists at first. Like in Minneapolis, people were saying that, and fortunately, there was an amazing Unicorn Riot live stream, so you could definitively answer that is not the case. But a ton of people online just like all the violence was done by like white Boogaloo Boy, Black Bloc working in tandem somehow, and then the real protesters would never do that. I mean, anyone who went outside knew what was going on, and if you didn't, you might start parroting these idiot things that you see online. So that's one reason to go out, just so you literally know what's happening. But yeah, in general, like, yeah, there or even people who do go out, sometimes they have different ideas. Like in New York, the fireworks conspiracy was this huge thing, where like as the uprising kind of like chilled out in June in New York in 2020, there was just a ton of fireworks going off all the time, and me and people I know like knew that this was mostly working class people lighting off fireworks like they do every year, but they're doing it a lot more this year because the city feels like liberated and free and they're celebrating. And yeah, it's like really bad for dogs. And like if you have a job in the morning, it's annoying. But this was like we understood that this was like literally a celebration of the uprising, of like coming out of the pandemic, when it was really locked down and uncertain and scary. But then people online, were even some people who like went out to protest and stuff, believed it was like an NYPD FBI conspiracy to question mark, question mark, question mark. So I think that's another evidence of like how far people are in like these kind of circles, like going away from the class. Like the class is in the middle, and then there's like these different circles of the left, or just online commentators in general, who are just like so far away from it they don't even know that working class people like fireworks. Like they think that must be a conspiracy.
Yeah, that's funny.
So we have to like go and see what the class really is and how they fight and what they think and talk to them. And even if we are of the class itself, like we need to see what's going on out there.
Yeah, I think it's I think there's a lot to pick apart. I mean, one thing that we've had that's been able to, I think make people doubt what they even participated in has been all these scandals around funding and disappearing money and stuff. But what's interesting about that is that almost none of that has anything to do with the initial impetus in the Twin Cities. Like, it's the NGOs developed either before that or after that. Like, and that's an interesting point of fragmentation, because I think a lot of people expect that when we move off the streets that we're going to go into those organizations and kind of formalize, and those organizations will be the representative of like what you call in the article the Party of Floyd. That isn't what happens hardly at all. And
you're saying you think the NGOs will fragment and become
no. They did, and with BLM there's a bunch of fragmented NGOs, and there was a bunch of like contestations of money, because no one owns the right to the name, and people could raise money for whatever.
We weren't talking about like actually an organization propping up called that. We're talking about the people who already exist, who are partisans of May 28th, who know what happened and support it.
I know. Well, what I'm saying is, like, I think most people think, all right, most people think, and again, whenever someone says that, you should take it with a grain of salt, but that you are moving, all right, that you are moving from like the impetus of the uprising into formal organizations that can maintain like a structured organizational spirit of that. The NGOs are terrible at that. Like, I know you weren't talking about the NGOs being the Party of Floyd. Like, that would be ridiculous. But I think that's what people feel gaslit about in a lot of ways. And I that term has also been used to fucking death. But the way people have tried to claim to speak for an event and what has been done with people speaking for that event is very different than the people who participated in that event and who remember it. And over time, it is very easy for people to recuperate the memory of something just by taking its name. Let's take Occupy, which we now can't really talk about anymore because of bullshit like Occupy Democrats. But that's kind of a theft of a name. I mean, like, I always remind people that, like, hey, that movement that Ad Busters kind of accidentally started, and we shouldn't even give them that much credit for that, was against a Democratic president. So, it spread like wildfire, particularly once the cops started being particularly ridiculous in New York.
Yeah, it was anarchist. It was like a mass anarchist movement.
Yeah. So as soon as that's over, you have these organizations that have that name, and almost always they seem completely divorced from the actual event. So yeah, I know you don't mean that. In fact, I think that's a long-standing pattern. I remember that about the alter globalization movement too, like the people speaking for Seattle in 1998, which is like my, that's my left coming of age. that like chased me away from the left from years. But it was actually a very similar thing where like I was there, I saw one thing, I got told it was something else by people, and then over years I just kind of like it kind of eroded away at my feelings of my own participation in that event.
Wow. I didn't know that about you.
Yeah, I became a right winger.
It's amazing, because you said we were the same age, but I'm younger than you then. I'm 35.
Oh no, I am 42. Okay, so we're not the same age.
You thought I was 42?
I have no idea. I figured Sean's about my age, so
people usually think I'm younger. Well, anyway, yeah, I meet people your age all the time who are like, yeah, I went to Seattle for whatever reason. Like I was part of some environmentalist group at college, or, I just had some friends going up there. And it was like all these people went there and were radicalized, and this movement started at and that was really the beginning of like a long series of these things. Occupy being one peak, Black Lives Matter and the George Floyd uprising, and Standing Rock being another. And it's still in a rising motion. Like Seattle wasn't, correct me if I'm wrong, but it wasn't like huge in terms of like the amount of people on the ground. It was more just like no one thought it was possible, and no one like imagined seeing something like that. And so
no one thought we could even temporarily win, even if we only won for like a year. Like,
so suddenly activism was like, oh, that's a thing that works. And I remember when I was a kid, even though I was too young to go to it, that stuff became very hip for the next 3 years. So all the
Hart and Aguirre were like on a bestseller list for real. I mean, people forget that, but I'm like, Empire, that Hart and Aguirre book was on a bestseller list in 1999. It was fucking weird, but also similar to now, like, so the G8 happened at Sea Island, which was in Georgia. Georgia weirdly shows up a lot. And we go to protest that, and there's no one there, and you just feel isolated. And actually, how I got sucked into the right wing for a couple of years was the only people who were really there were like anti-war libertarians and like some particularly unsavory people from International Answer. Like, that was it. And we spent some time in one of those protest cages, and I like felt really demoralized and walked away. And it was a very strange moment, because it was one of those times where you felt like you got gaslit about something you participated in. And then, okay, well, it wasn't what we thought it was. What do we do now? And I remember all this pro Ahmadinejad stuff that was coming out of International Answer at the time, and it just like pushed me further and further away for the left not for a super long time, but for long enough that I had some pretty sketchy politics for a while. I think that happened to a lot of people like Occupy. We talk about like how all these reactionaries come out of that. I think part of that process. I don't think we did see that, though, with the Floyd uprisings. I think we have just seen demobilization and like massive recuperation in media. So I think it has been substantively different in a way that seems important.
Yeah. I think you're onto something here, which is that you said like Hart and Aguirre were bestsellers, and then for Occupy, like David Graeber was probably a bestseller, and like Glenn Beck was talking about Tikkun on Fox News.
Yeah.
But then like, after the George Floyd uprising, you sort of get like these more liberal books becoming bestsellers. And even though the writing itself was like extremely popular, we're maybe selling some like Malcolm X books or something, but like no, like, Afro-pessimism, for example, did not seize the moment. There weren't really a lot of examples of the Black radical tradition emerging besides like certain abolitionist writers. So it never really got theorized. And obviously, like, there's a lot of people like in our milieu doing that, like EndNotes put out a whole issue about it, and SM28 writes about this stuff, and Toby Haslett, and like there's a handful of like really great takes on George Floyd, but like a really small amount which I do think indicates a certain kind of like lack of memory and consciousness about what we had gone through. And memory fades quickly in all the examples we talked about before, but seemed to have faded very quickly with this one. But I still run into people who like remember it, and like it's like something they haven't thought about in months. Like, oh yeah, that was really crazy, and like, so the stories that people can share about it are, things that they never thought they'd see in their lives. And we've forgotten that like things can change in a moment. Like, and so one more point I want to make before my audio cuts out again. Is it doing okay right now?
Yeah, you're going fine right now.
So even though we never really had anything like really like theoretically pop off after the uprising, I think it's very notable that one of the first two things Elon Musk does when he buys Twitter is bans CrimethInc and bans It's Going Down. And one of the only right wingers talking about Defend the Forest before the raid last week and the terror charges before that was Elon Musk responding to Andy No. Andy No's been pushing the Defend the Forest stuff for a long time, saying like, look at this Antifa autonomous zone. But for whatever reason, the right wing just didn't care. But Musk was one of the first people to care, and that's when he banned It's Going Down. So I think like even though to the left, like the more direct action, anarchistic kind of stuff isn't super popular and it's not really generalizing, and even it's not really generalizing amongst the working class in general, of course, it's still very marginal. And if as someone who like sees how much social media engagement these sites get, I know it's very marginal, but the ruling class is afraid of them because like they know that these are the people who are theorizing and supporting the kinds of things that are haunt their nightmares, which is masses of people marching on them and taking all their stuff and killing them. So like, even though the idea is marginal, this is like what haunts the dreams of the bourgeoisie.
It does. Which is why I think you're going to see a lot more domestic terrorism charges. And this is why I thought we saw a lot of them in the early aughts too. I mean, it was, I remember that we used to talk about green is the new red. And by that, we meant green anarchists being treated like communists in the 50s. Not that they all became communist, although they should. But whatever, I'm not going to shame people that are doing good work, but they were getting hit.
John Zerzan's a communist.
Good.
He was he was a ultra left communist before he became anarcho primitivist. He was he wrote for Zero Work.
Yeah, I actually, we could talk one day about what happened to the post left anarchist scene. Because I was radicalized and then de-radicalized during that period.
Yeah.
But there's a little John Zerzan in my head that I'm always fighting.
Do you ever read John Zerzan? It's awesome.
Yeah.
Like, it's not a lot of it's just not correct, but he's like a beatnik, it's beautiful. He writes about like silence and like what it must have been like to be a Neanderthal and stuff like that. It's not like the annoying, like smash your TV Anpriv collect like voice.
Oh no, it was. He actually was doing what I thought was interesting work on reification and just takes it to like an absurd conclusion, which is basically we need to lobotomize humanity. But he's a fun read. Actually, a lot of that stuff. It's interesting though, because I think there were natural divisions about what part of that you were going to lay into. We can see the opposite pathway of Zerzan when you look at Derick Jensen. But that's no longer. We just shouldn't re-legislate the early aughts.
All right, but get this: Derick Jensen, is in touch with. I think this is the story, but Derick Jensen is in touch with Ted Kaczynski, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Zerzan is too, and I think maybe Jensen and Zerzan, I'm not sure, but Kaczynski was like, look, the terrorism was a big mistake. It didn't work. It's not going to work. What we need is a party. We need a Leninist ecological party. Go make it. And that's what Deep Green Resistance was supposed to be, like a Leninist cadre Anpriv organization. And which I think is actually a good idea, especially for the time. Like, I don't know why no other group was really trying it. But then they just became TERFs immediately, and that's like, and it ended there. Like, they just couldn't help themselves. They just couldn't say like, all right, we have some different ideas about gender, but it's not important. Like, it's not what we're about. They had to become TERFs like first. Do you remember this at all?
No, I remember this. I remember immediately how anti-trans they became. And actually, I also remember certain groups that I even knew. Like I knew one of the people in Natasha who just became out and out eco-fascist. So in fact, I was part of the split off of North Star magazine that a bunch of anarchists who worked with us did, called Ritual Magazine Part 1, and they published Tasha first, and then they went all fashy,
Right.
So yeah, and it came out of this idea of like, we need an Amprim party. In the post left municipalist debates, someone's like yelling, I actually am not a super big fan of Graeber in a lot of ways. But I am a big fan of elements of Bookchin. Or or I would tell people, if they want to get into like critique of technology that's a little bit more sound, and I think Saracen maybe pulls from some of these people, I would read a lot of the indigenous writers from who were writing about 15 years ago. So although Mike Goldhawk is still keeping some of that up in his discussion about land as a relation. And I think that's helpful in framing why you would care about the use of these forest out in Georgia to tie it back in. But we also just have to look at, like, we will need direct action. Because I hate to tell people, but maybe the last couple of weeks have woken people up from some of their union officialdom. And I say this, I'm in a union, before people at me. I'm even a rep, but
I'm not.
It's fine.
I would never.
But union leadership right now is so well invested in land that it has no real impetus to grow. Like, I mean, I'm very serious about that. And the areas that are being unionized right now of the economy are transitional workers, which don't have, what I mean transitional workers, it's food service, it's TAs, things that you don't tend to do for more than 4 to 6 years. And so a lot of investment in the labor movement has been kind of put forward by people around the DSA. And again, I don't want to call it, like, the DSA is a mixed organization. I'm not calling it out. It's just, what you read in Jacobin every day. Although Jacobin didn't actually do a report on what I'm talking about, so I'll give him credit for that. What you see is a kind of like, we're seeing this labor movement because we are seeing real worker activity. I think absolutely that's 100% real. But it's not translating into formal organizations, and yet people tend to be told that it is. And I am kind of getting frustrated because I don't think that's what we need right now. Like, and the reasons why are like the reasons why I just said, like the unions themselves are very well invested in land. Their revenues have gone up, but their
Do
net
you
assets,
mean literally invested
yes,
in
I
land?
mean literally invested in
Okay.
land.
I thought
Like,
the whole time you were talking, I was like was that a metaphor?
nope.
What does it mean?
It means they're like, I mean, literally, they own a lot of property,
They're
and
like the
their
Church of
assets.
Scientology?
Yes, and their assets have gone up after their membership have dropped, and the assets have gone up basically off of leveraging the appreciation of their land, of their property holdings, into stocks. So, like, right now, the unions are on paper richer than they've ever been at the moment, where they have the lowest union density that we've had since we've had a union movement in the beginning of the 20th century.
That's amazing.
Like, so like there's no incentive for the leadership to give a shit.
Wow. Settlers was right.
So
Is that book good? Is Jay Sakai's Settlers a good book? I've never read it, but most people who read it tell me it's actually good.
So I have read it, and I found parts of it to be laughably sloppy in its historical analysis, but I find parts of it to be very correct. So I think it's a mixed bag. I think it's a good. I think it's also the labor aristocracy explanatory framework is sloppy. It's just like that doesn't really hold up.
But
But
if you like, now that I like John Zerzan, and so I'll probably like this, right?
Yeah, you'll probably like it. I mean, you'll either become more of an anarchist or more of a Stalinist, depending on how you read it.
I don't think I can become a Stalinist. I think those days, I think there was like a moment where I said, well, let me just think about if I could. And I was like, no, I just can't. That's ridiculous. I guess I am just an anarchist. But, I think that anarchism isn't the anarchist movement. Like the people who are anarchists aren't the anarchists. Like, I just think I just think that anarchism is the way that people sort of naturally think and struggle right now, which still has all the problems of anarchism, is the historical problems of it being short-sighted and idealistic and petty bourgeois and all that stuff. But people are just, I think, naturally anarchistic now. They don't want to be leaders. They don't want to be led. They don't want to be disciplined in some formal organization. They don't want to work. They don't really give a shit about like parliamentary politics. And I think that's a huge drawback because we just can't if we tell people to go organize, it's just a fool's errand, because the best thing you can organize is an email list. But on the other hand, it has these incredible potentials of like the sort of spontaneous breaks and revolts that we haven't seen in a very long time.
I think that in those essays we once talked about on your show talks about these knob movements, which I think is what we have. And I think the reasons for that are sociologically complicated, and I could like spend hours explaining my theories about why that is happening. But more or less, I would just say, yeah, I'd agree with you. People are inclined to be anarchists because they're hyper alienated. They don't want to work. I don't blame them for that. And yeah. So I'm hearing people tell me that I'm false on the read. I will tell you, look up Radish Research's whole thing on the assets. In fact, I happen to have just done a video on it, and so I have it pulled up. And I'll show it to you. And people who work in a lot of unions yell at me about this, but they're in part of it. Now, you might ask yourself why did the Teamsters go bankrupt? I think the Teamsters are not have trouble making their assets liquid. But I'm going to bring this up real fast. This is from a paper called Labor's Fortress Finance. I'm also going to bring Andy back. You can see here, and I'll make this bigger for you guys. No, I'm wrong screen. Too many screens up today. Okay. You can see here, revenue surplus has gone up precipitously. Actually, even since 2018, net assets has dramatically increased for most unions. Now, this is all unions in aggregate. I can't speak to individual unions on this. And we see membership declining both in real terms from 2010 and in relative terms in terms of density. So, there you go.
That's anarchism in action.
So, that's That
Hey, I'm gonna.
is. Mhm.
I'm like gonna make a soup, and I'm like just thinking about the soup. So
Yeah, so we should wrap up.
well, no,
Um,
I'll take questions from the chat. I'll like hang out for another 10 minutes or something. But I just gotta tell you that I got soup on the brain.
all right. So chat questions.
Or maybe you can give me one last question.
So I guess I want to
In lieu
ask
of.
you, like, if we see a lot of, like, I do think is real is I do think we're actually seeing a lot of workers' activities. I think that's absolutely real. I'm not telling anyone that that's false because I've seen it too. And it could be things as small as like everybody quitting in a shop and then getting rehired, so they get rehired at the new pay rate, like those kinds of things, and they're not really recorded, but it does happen, and we know it's happening.
Quiet quitting, I'm convinced, is like huge. Like it's a real thing, and it's because people they don't care. Fire me, I don't care. Like they're just that's the attitude.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't blame him for that either. And I will also say, you know, it is funny that it takes like people being like, I'm going to quiet quit. That means I'm just going to work to contract or work to order or work to hour exactly, which is like what they should have been doing the whole time.
Right, work to
But,
rule.
so yeah, I guess, one thing we can ask ourselves, and I want your thought about this. There's a lot of people who think that like the hope is in the developing world. I am, um, I am torn on this, and I have been for a long time because uh, I I actually, when we talk about the settler colonial thesis, there's parts of it that I just think are factually not true. Like they're like uh, labor in a lot of the developed worlds actually, um, by labor arbitrage, kept from being as productive as first world labor, which is an interesting thing to think about. Like, why the hell would capital uh, want less productive labor in certain areas that was high extraction? And it's because they want to be able to leverage comparative advantage on purchasing power, for raw goods and stuff like that. And Marxists have a hard time dealing with that, because we don't tend to think about like infrastructure theft and our in the way we talk about class analysis. Um, but I also just don't necessarily see a lot of the same kinds of militancy in organizations. I see it a lot more just like we see here in riots and uprisings, and uh the moment that a lot of these things become codified in like a party, like we see in the quote second pink wave, it dies. um uh and so, I think the conditions that we talk about in the quote developed unquote world are just as predominant in the quote, or not just as predominant, but becoming as predominant and the quote undeveloped unquote world. And those are both in quotations for reasons that should be obvious. um so if you were going to, like, if we're gonna survive until the next round of militancy seems viable again, what do you think we should do? Because we can't rely on anybody else for that.
Yeah, well, I the best answer is just like do what you can do. Like,
Mm-hmm.
the figure out what you can do, whether it's hosting a fundraiser or starting a reading group or starting a group of friends who just wants to get together and talk about politics, as a group chat or a podcast or a reading group, and dedicate yourself to like following what's happening in your city, in your neighborhood, and going out to a demonstration when you think it might pop off and writing about it or participating in it. These are just a few ideas. Like you can write to prisoners. You can join the mutual aid group, even though if you think it's anarchist and cringe, whatever, you might find that it's not as bad as you think. Um, And, these are all things that I think anyone could do. But then beyond that, you got to figure out how to expand your capacity to help the people that are fighting and struggling, whether it be striking workers or whether it be the forest defenders or whether it be people who went to prison for participating in the George Floyd uprising. What can you do to support them? And what are you going to do when that struggle comes close to you? And so I tell people who are totally black pilled and like participated in the uprising, but like since then they've drifted off in some like apolitical or post left ironic direction. I'll tell them that's fine. I don't blame you, but just like the uprising is going to happen again, and I just want you to go out there. Like I want to make sure that you're going to go back. Like you can hate the left. That makes sense. That's totally reasonable. But as long as you still know what side you're on, which is the revolutionary proletariat.
Yeah. I would say the same thing. And I would say, like, yeah, sure, critique the left. Yeah, sure, critique the professional left. Yeah, sure, critique unions. Yeah, sure, even critique the kinds of stuff we saw in the uprising sometimes. Critique is fine. But you still got to do shit. And I don't tell people to just spin their reels and do shit. You need to do shit in a programmatic way. But we don't know what the program is. And anyone who tries to tell you they know what the program is at this moment is probably a snake oil salesman. We have to build the program ourselves through doing stuff, right? And so it requires us to go out there. And that's what I tell people. Like, if you listen to podcasters who never actually take part in any of this or only take part of it in like the electoral arena, at best they just don't know what's going on. Like, and that's an important thing to remember. Thank you so much for coming on, Amy. I'm sorry we had the weird technical problems today. I'm glad that it ended with you being clear.
It was a pleasure. I just want to answer one question. It's going to be a celeriac potato soup.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah. Now you know why I'm a little distracted, because I'm thinking about that.
So go have your soup.
Okay.
All right.
Good night, everybody.
Bye-bye. All right. It's just me. This was kind of impromptu. Tomorrow there will also be a live stream. Hopefully we don't have the audio problems. I don't know what's going on today. But I didn't plan this originally to be live. Then the Tortuga killing happened. The Tortuguita killing happened last week, and we decided they should be live. I was going to do a more theoretical discussion on the Akron essay, which tell people I put a link to to Spirit of May 28 in the show notes. So go read that Akron essay. I think it's actually pretty helpful. So I think that should be one of the things we look at. So tomorrow, there will be another live stream, and then I won't be live for a while. And it will be with Alex Vaculo. I think that's how you say his name. It's, I believe, Portuguese. I'm not certain though. And it might be. And we will be talking about inflation, and it is a joint Strange Matters Varn vlog production. And on Sunday for patrons, there will be a Q&A, and I will have a surprise co-host that I've already talked to help me with the Q&A, so I don't have to focus on monitoring the questions and also answering them. So we will be doing that. Thank you so much for coming out. Thank you for enjoying it. I apologize if you made it through the nasty audio parts. There seems to be some weird buffering thing today. I'm going to be working on that tonight. Have a great evening, and I'm going to leave you with an outro.